So, Amy, thank you so much for joining this conversation around the theme of the future is calling us to greatness.
It is my total pleasure, Michael.
So, Amy, I first encountered your work less than a year ago when I read the hardcover edition of Environmental Debt, and I just found it to be a brilliantly written and very important book for our time. So I knew I wanted to have you in this conversation. But I'm also realizing that some
I am
of
delighted.
but I'm also realizing that some of the viewers and listeners may not be familiar with your work yet. So, could you just begin by letting people know sort of who you are, what you're known for, or what your contributions have been, and how you got to this place?
My background is as a producer and entrepreneur, and throughout my whole adult life, I first was a volunteer for Greenpeace for 25 years and then worked for them for 12 years. And as a volunteer, I did everything from produce walkathons and concerts and fundraisers and was on the board twice. And then I became the solutions director of Greenpeace in 2005. And when I did that, I had the incredible opportunity of following on decades of work of fellow Greenpeace activists, but perhaps working in a new way with corporations where the emphasis was on solutions. So every time I would go into a meeting with a corporation, at the end they would always say, well, never expected to have this kind of meeting with Greenpeacers. And I'd always say the only reason I am here is because my colleagues jumped on your roof or because they did something that got your attention.
Yeah,
That's the reason we're here.
yeah.
However, once you're there, once you're in the room, you can do the impossible.
Wow.
And so that was, I think, spectacularly informative and successful work for Greenpeace, for the environment, but also for the corporations. And honestly, that work changed my life and was the reason why I ended up writing this book. So that's how I came to writing the book. My work life, on top of the Greenpeace work, was largely as a producer in the arts in New York, Seattle, and Europe. But I also started one of the first affinity marketing companies in the mid-'80s called Message Check. And that was very successful, and we gave millions and millions of dollars to our nonprofit clients. I think that for my whole life, I have been an activist of some kind in the arts, in the environment, for social causes, candidates. And I have always felt if you do not connect commerce and with the culture and social mission,
Yeah.
you will not have enough power
Yep.
to embed what you're trying to have happen. And for corporations, if they do not incorporate the realization that they are living in a world, in a place that has a society, that has an environment, and they think they can screw that up without consciousness, they will fail. So I have always felt public-private is where it's at.
Yeah. That's great. That's great, Amy. Could you say a little bit more, because this is really in my experience, is one of the gifts of your book, is that it really does bring this conversation of business, commerce, and environmental sustainability, and more than just sustainability, we don't want to sustain the damage, but really, how can we have an economy that brings us into what my mentor Thomas Berry called a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship, where we benefit from the earth and we're a blessing or a benefit to the earth community. And I think some of the things you've outlined in your book really point us strongly in that direction. So could you go a little bit more into how you see us moving forward, and really sort of the core argument of your book? I'd love you to articulate that.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for not using the word sustainability. I try never to use it. Occasionally I have to because it's the right word. But I think that first of all, we are in a fight for survival, not for sustainability.
Yep.
Make no bones about it. We are, it is about survival. So
Yes.
thank you for
Yes.
making that distinction. And I think that, you know, I would go back to Will, uh, Wilberforce and the abolitionists who worked as co-belligerents. You know, sometimes there are things more, I'm sure that has meaning to you. And I came to it because I've been writing, I write for The Guardian now regularly.
Uh-huh.
And I was researching a piece that I just wrote about radical cooperation. And I think that I went to look for examples of that. And of course, the abolitionists came up, where people who do not necessarily share a worldview, people who do not have or seemingly don't have similar values can work together for something that is greater than themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I would submit that survival, clean air and water are greater than ourselves. You and I mean quite little in the scheme of the world. But clean air and clean water is central to the scheme of the world of the human race and every other race.
Amen.
So for me, I think what I have found is that when you work with people and presume that they hold those values, that is not a particularly, that's not a Greenpeace value. That's not a radical value. You need clean air and water? Good, me too.
Yeah.
Let's get it. Let's do that together. And so I think that my basic premise of my book is twofold. Number one, no nature, no business. So forget about it. You either have a business that maintains the natural world and respects it, uses it carefully, consciously, conservatively, or you and everyone else are going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
So that's number one. And the second is that we speak about what is expensive very untruthfully. So, for example, well, we have to use coal and natural gas and oil because they're cheap energies. They're not cheap.
Exactly.
The only reason they appear cheap is because we do not include their real costs in the we do not include the real costs that they incur for the product or for the company or for the purchaser. So when I give speeches, I always say, you're already paying a carbon tax. You're just not
good.
paying it where you should be paying it. You're paying it for healthcare, where in the United States, healthcare, because of pollution, costs more than healthcare from tobacco. So you are paying more for health, for pollution in healthcare. Try to wrap your head around that. That's just healthcare. Infrastructure rebuilding, emergency services, drought. You have industries at risk. Every time there is a wildfire, a drought, a flood, not only does it disrupt people and habitats and animals, it disrupts business.
Yes.
So you can, and until we pay for the real costs of what we use, our economy on some level is, on some fundamental level, is broken.
Yes.
And so I tried as hard as I could to come up with 3 rules that I thought would encompass this basic premise. The first one is pollution can no longer be free and can no longer be subsidized.
Yep.
Because right now, we sometimes charge a company for pollution from a big dramatic act. When there's a big accident, BP paid some money for the cleanup. But it would be much smarter, well, and of course, it does not pay for the whole cleanup at all, ever. And you cannot clean it up. So cleanup is kind of a word a little bit like sustainability. It's a fake word.
Yeah.
The second rule is that the long view must guide all decision making and accounting. So an example is the Thai floods that happened a few years ago where all of Thailand was shut down for 6 months. So obviously that is very, very dramatic impact on people and the businesses of Thailand. It was such a cataclysmic flood, not because of the big storm, which was bad, but because there was no topsoil left,
Yes.
deforestation from the 20 years prior.
Yep.
So the people that cut down the trees in the 90s and the aughts caused cataclysmic floods in 2009. Now, not only did it harm Thailand, it harmed the factories in Thailand were unable to supply the auto parts to factories in Kentucky, Singapore, and the Philippines.
Yeah.
So you and I paid unemployment insurance for people in Kentucky. All of the regions where there were auto plants in Kentucky, Singapore, and Philippines were in big trouble. And Toyota lost 2.5% of its annual output because of trees that were cut down 15 and 20 years earlier.
Yep.
No accounting took those numbers into account. You have to look at the long-term consequences. And the third thing is that government plays a vital role in catalyzing clean technology and growth while preventing environmental destruction.
Yeah.
So obviously, the internet, you and I are speaking on Skype now, and thank you, United States government, for developing the internet. Really, thank you. That spawned trillions of dollars of industry. Trillions and trillions of dollars of industry. It altered the world in ways we cannot even conceive of yet.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened because the government had some wacky scientists who thought we needed it. And I'm sure it came from a military, and it did come from military research, but there occasionally are very, very, very good uses for military research.
Yeah.
Actually, often there are. In fact, I shouldn't be glib about it. The military, in fact, has developed tremendous technologies in alternative energy.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a long way of coming to.
Well, no, I so appreciate you going into some depth around it, because it's the simplicity of this nature means business model that you've been offering that I found to be one of its most alluring and also memorable. I mean, when somebody can remember the core argument of a book, that there are three core fundamental principles or rules that we really have to abide by if humanity is going to survive. We can no longer allow for the free or subsidized polluting of the commons. Allowing for individuals or corporations to get wealthy by polluting the air, water, soil, and life upon which we all depend is collective insanity. So that's the first one. Number two, number two is that we've got to take the long view in mind. We can no longer have as quarterly profits or next year's statement or whatever be the measure of our success, be the measure of our progress. That's also collective insanity. And the idea that government doesn't have a role to play is just as simply collective insanity. Government has a vital role to play. So the way you've articulated that I found to be so elegant, simple, and yet powerful, prophetically powerful.
Michael, you are warming my heart. Thank you.
Well, it's the truth. See, one of the things that I've been doing, just to give you a little background, my wife and I, Connie Barlow, my wife, is a science writer, and I'm a minister. We've both done environmental activism and sustainability work for many years. And we've been living on the road, traveling all over North America, sort of preaching and teaching the sacred side of science and what I call right relationship to reality. What does it mean for us as individuals and collectives to come into right relationship with what's fundamentally and inescapably real? And so this is our shtick. This is what we do. We've spoken to close to 2,000 groups. And I read a book back in, I think, 2001 by John Stewart called Evolution's Arrow, the direction of evolution and the future of humanity. And he talks about throughout evolutionary history, what we keep finding, and it's not a coincidence that we keep finding this, is that we keep finding systems, biological systems and then social systems, that find a way to effectively align the self-interest of the parts with the well-being of the whole. So the impact of the part is reflected back to the part. So if the part has a positive impact on the community or the whole or the organism or whatever, it benefits. So it's incentivized to do the right thing. And if the part has a negative impact on the community or the tribe or the whatever, or the cell or the organism, then there's some negative repercussions. So that it aligns self-interest at multiple levels. And so one of the things John was making the case for, and that I've been speaking about for more than a decade, is that one of the most important things we need to do is to integrate true cost and to no longer allow for the freer, what you call the freer subsidized polluting of the commons, and that we've got to find a way of aligning the natural self-interest of individuals, corporations, and nations with the well-being of the body of life. And so your articulation of that, especially in the first two principles, but the third one as well, that governance does play a role. In fact, what John...
Huge role.
Yeah.
Huge role. So, I am working on something now, trying to get... first of all, there are huge numbers of people globally, organizations, corporations, that are trying to change accounting systems to internalize these external costs that should be included at the moment. And it's going to take a decade to change these rules. It is complicated beyond belief, and every time groups come in to present a new option, it's a nervous breakdown to look at them. But they continue to do this work, and it's crucially important.
Yep.
But my experience in working with companies is that there is one possible rule that could alter how infrastructure investments are made, and I am working with some companies now trying to move that forward, and that is that there should be accelerated depreciation for clean infrastructure investments. So right now, I tell this story in the book, and it was one of the sources of why I came up with this idea. PepsiCo created a new factory. They built a state-of-the-art factory in Arizona. It was near net zero wastewater and energy. And the engineer who led the development of this factory was telling me about it, and I was really suitably impressed. It was pretty extraordinary engineering. And he's a conservative Texan. He and I do not see eye to eye on many, many things. And on this, hats off, chapeau to him. And on much of his work, he does spectacular work. And so I said, so are you going to deploy these new technologies in all your factories globally? And he said, well, it's more expensive to put them in, even though in 5 years it will have huge amounts of savings, plus it will be near net zero wastewater and energy. We would like to do them all, but we have to pick and choose because it's an expensive upfront expense, and our quarterly and even annual earnings will take a hit. And I said, that's crazy.
Yes, exactly.
Basically. And so I immediately asked, well, what would happen if you had accelerated depreciation?
Right.
And then the VP in Global Public Policy was with us. He said, are you kidding? We would do this. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward thing. So here is a corporation having done really good work, wanting to do it more and better and faster. And because accounting does not take in the long term, And because they are at the mercy of shareholders who are looking at short term impacts, they, in fact, are not doing everything they want to do. So that is insane. Anyway, so as after I asked uh, PepsiCo what they thought of it, I began asking companies, and every single company that I asked went, same response as PepsiCo.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have no idea. We would do this, 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 this. So that's something I'm working on now
That
as a
that
quick.
yeah, that's great because that's sort of one of those trim tab kind of things. Like if
Exactly.
one shift could make an enormous difference.
And I think that, you know, when those of us who are environmental activists speak to the public, as you and I do, all of us have been told if you become alarmist, you are ineffective. And so then you and I, or people like us, will go to the bar and be alarmists together because it's alarming out there.
Exactly.
And I think that my experience is that many, many, many people in companies have the same feeling.
Yeah.
It is not, it is not, I mean, I've been drinking with everyone, right? And it is not unique to people who look like or feel like a typical environmental activist, people who work as farmers, people who manage water systems, people who deal with any kind of commodity, lawyers who are doing transactions across the spectrum. They are much more vocal and are beginning to
Yeah.
me fairly vocal publicly as
Yeah.
well, that they are completely freaking out about the environmental consequences, especially climate change.
Yeah.
I'm not saying anything that anyone in a corporation knows is not the case.
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. And what I've discovered in talking with people who work with business people, such as yourself, is that there are lots of business people that get this in a far deeper, more compelling way than some of our politicians do. And they're starting to speak with one voice that we need a level playing field. For example,
Yeah,
we need to, whether you call it a revenue neutral tax on carbon or fee and dividend or whatever, but until we somehow level the playing field in that way, companies that want to do the right thing can't really do it without causing their own disadvantage in the process.
right. Currently, the biggest polluter makes the biggest profit. And until we change that rule,
Yep.
until politicians, certainly in our country, there is barely a politician who is willing to speak up the way corporate leaders have been willing to speak up. Bob Crane of NRG, one of the larger electric energy producers in the country, he recently wrote a shareholder letter that says our children will hold us accountable.
Yes, exactly.
And Bob Inglis, who you probably know,
Yes. Yep.
I'm sure you probably know him well, who was a conservative Republican who spoke much the way you do, saying we have to stand up and deal with this in a real way. And of
Yeah.
course, he was voted out of office
Yeah.
because I think another thing that is a really big spiritual or cultural change that has to happen, especially in the United States, but the whole world, is that we are all living, not all, we presume we are entitled to live like kings with everything, with easy access, everything. Money is barely an object, so a T-shirt can be $5. An iPhone that has the world in its in your pocket should be $100, and everything in your house. I want to do this, I want to do that. I want to do this, and we do not there are two basic connections that I think are sacred that we have broken. And the first one is the obvious one with the natural world. But I think the second one is one of the best books that I read in the last 20 years was by Jerry Mander, and it's called In the Absence of the Sacred.
Yeah, I've read it too.
And it's a beautiful book. And in it, he talks about how when he was a child, he would go shopping. And it was a social, he would go with his mother to the store. And it was a social act. It was a basic glue of his community. The merchants and what they sold with the community, with their customers. And he said, and at some point in my childhood, the small stores became replaced by big companies where nobody knew or cared who their customers were. Now, they care who their customers are broad scale, but the change from the social piece of commerce is not to be denied.
Yeah.
And it is missing. And the great thing is that the generation after us is creating an economy where they're sharing things. They are, from Airbnb to Uber and Lyft to they're sharing lawnmowers and they're sharing 3D printers. They're sharing things, which is a really interesting new take
Yes.
on reinserting the social into the commercial.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also agree on the assessment that Jerry Manner's book is fabulous. One of the things that I've been preaching a lot about lately, in fact, I just did a sermon where I talked about this last Sunday, because this year Connie and I are preaching and teaching in churches and colleges along the route of the Great March for Climate Action. So we're going from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. over 9 months. And is this notion that we have thought, we religious people, okay, so I speak to secular groups and religious groups, and religious people have been thinking that somehow we could think of God without also thinking about nature, as if nature was somehow separate from or distant from, or, that God was somehow divorced from nature. And we forget the way language works, that the word nature didn't exist for the Hebrews. The word reality didn't exist for the Hebrews. That what we call nature, what we call reality, they called Yahweh. And so one of the things I'm trying to do with religious people is help them stop using a trivial understanding of God, that whatever we mean by the word God has got to be inclusive of time, nature, and mystery, which are three things I see as fundamentally real, whether you believe in them or not. And so I think that sense that in the absence of the sacred, when God is absent, when we think of God as only otherworldly or supernatural, rather than including the natural and embodied in time, then we treat nature as an I-it relationship rather than an I-thou relationship. So we don't have this respectful,
Well,
honorable relationship.
and obviously that is the ultimate sacred bond that somehow is not embedded in our culture. It's not embedded in how we live, although also the generation after us is in fact also getting closer, recreating roots in that way. But the mass merchandising of everything, from food to clothing to stuff. Sometimes you go into people's houses and you see the number of toys in a house and you think, this is crazy. And of course, all the kids want to do is play with a box.
Yeah, that consumerism has become the de facto religion of the West, I think, is fairly undeniable.
Yes. And it is horrifying. I also think, to imagine, I eat meat, not very much, but I do eat it and I try to eat less and less. But, you know, very often be with friends or some eating event or some dining event, and people will say, "Oh well, I don't want to eat a whole fish because I don't want to see the eyes. It's like, well, then don't eat the fish. It's a fish, or I don't want to eat the, meat or whatever because it's like, it's a pig. It's a pig. If you don't want to deal with the fact that it's a pig, then don't eat the pig.
Right.
And if you do eat the pig, you know, be very cognizant of the fact that you are eating another being. Thank you to nature that gives that to us, and also the consequences of eating that pig, which is that it is very, very high in the food chain, which goes back to the we think we are entitled to live like kings.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, Amy, I want to come back to some of the things that you discussed in your book because when Connie read your book, I read it first and then Connie read it afterwards. And what we both found really helpful and hopeful was some of the stories that you relayed in terms of things that we just didn't know. I mean, so oftentimes those of us in the environmental movement and sustainability movement and help trying to ensure a healthy future and all that kind of stuff can portray corporations as the problem, the evil, whatever, and yet business drives so much. And so you had any stories that you'd be willing to share in terms of your own experience where some businesses or corporations or those within the realm of commerce are doing the right thing or helping to move us in the right direction.
Well, I would say there are many, many, many corporations doing great things. So, and in my book, as you mentioned, there's a chapter called Courage, and I describe some of the work that McDonald's did on preventing the destruction of the Amazon forest for soy for their animals. Tiffany's work on changing mining protocols and where they mine. Uh, Coke, Pepsi, and Unilever and their work on refrigeration. And Walmart's sustainability initiative. And also, I talk about the passage of the Clean Air Act in 1970, where a Democrat Ed Muskie and Republican Howard Baker led the United States Congress to pass a radical bill. And you want to be grateful that the air in the United States is not like the air in China? Well, you should
Amen.
tip your hat to Ed Muskie and Howard Baker.
Yep.
And Republicans and Democrats on their Senate subcommittee that took that bill as it was. And for strange, strange people, Michigan senator who went to Nixon and said, sign it. So I think that the work with corporations, it goes back to what I said earlier about co-belligerence. So many of the companies that I wrote about, I would not call them sustainable companies. However, I think that in general, they all have a long, long way to go. However, each of them has done something extraordinary, which has, I think, honestly changed the DNA of their company. When you do something that powerful for the good, you are changed. You in some ways become. I'm not quite sure what the word is, but I know from my work with all of these people, they are changed. They are aware that they can do something impossible within their companies and in the world and with activists who they thought they would never work with and alter the course of history. And if they had their way, they would do that more, as hard as it is.
Yeah.
And our job is to change the accounting rules, to change what I always say is that our work is to harmonize the rules of business with the laws of nature.
Yeah, amen. Well, and that's what I call coming into right relationship to reality. Exactly what you just articulated.
Yes, yes.
Well, Amy, if you were speaking, one of the things that I want to, well, actually, first, there's a question that Connie, my wife, has wanted me to ask the various people involved in this, and it's a fun question. I purposely don't let you know ahead of time what it is, but if you were to invite over for dinner, or go out and have a glass of wine or a beer with three people throughout human history, and
Oh my God.
any three people, who would you love to share a meal with, or a glass of wine or a beer with? Who would you love to have a conversation with in an informal way, and why?
Maybe Jung.
Hmm. Why Carl
Uh,
Jung?
because I think that the subconscious life runs the whole show. And that's one of the other things that we ignore in our modern world.
Hmm.
We presume that the empirical world is the world. And certainly it is the conscious part of our world. However, as we all know from our own foibles and the strengths of the people we around us who we love or don't love, uh, we are motivated by things more deeper and uh, unknown. I mean, it is our dreams tell us so many things, and I think I loved how Jung put that forward, and I think he did alter the course of psychology, the new study of psychology. And, uh, probably, I don't,
It could even be somebody alive today.
probably Michelangelo.
Mm.
You know, I think, and speaking of, I mean, Michelangelo in some ways goes with Jung because, people always describe his work, it's as if it's coming out of the stone. And I think that uh, when you see his work, especially I prigionieri, the slaves that are in the room with the David,
Hmm.
and having been to the Marble Mountains where he got his, there is something, it could make a nice atheist girl good religious. What can I say?
That's great. Well, Amy, there's two questions that I want to really sort of conclude this our time together with. They're related. One of them is, where do you personally find your inspiration to wake up and be engaged in this great work? And then, related to that, what would you say to some young person that would inspire them? Because this whole theme that the future is calling us to greatness, obviously I'm personifying the future. I suggest that that's a very useful belief, that to imagine how the future is calling us to be a blessing, to sacrifice, to contribute in a way that costs us something, and yet that will be a tremendous blessing to them. So what is it that you personally find that inspires you on a day-by-day or week-by-week basis? And then what would you say to some young person who's perhaps maybe overwhelmed by the challenges of our time and look into the future and it's pretty scary? What would you say to some young person?
Well, I think what inspires me are twofold. Obviously, my family and the young people I love so dearly, whose lives I want the world to be their oyster, and it doesn't look so good for that. So that's one thing. But, and the other thing I think that inspires me, I guess there are two things that I think are truly otherworldly. One is art and one is nature. And I think the natural world is so amazing. I mean, you do not have to be a scientist to have your mind blown by how, you know, the relationship from the bacteria to the barnacles to the acid and out. I mean, everything about the web of nature is miraculously complex and miraculously simple.
Yeah.
And to me, it is, you know, it's not just getting drunk on the lilacs that one can smell in season today, because really they are. It is drunkenness. It is so beautiful. It is, but it is the web, which is insanely amazing. It is, to me, wondrous, miraculous, inspiring, and worthy of protecting every moment of my life. It
Amen.
is, it is, it is to be cared for as much as one's children and family. To me, it is. So that's what inspires me.
Hmm.
And I think what I would say to young people first and foremost is put your phones down. Notice the world around you without electronic additions. Spend a moment, look at a bird, look at the floor of the forest, see what's going on there. Plant something, watch it grow.
Hmm.
And I think that will inspire you to do great things,
Yeah.
because I think that once you love or respect or understand the bond or are intrinsically connected through the natural world, you'll find what you're going to do. I mean, I can't say to a young person, go be a political activist. You could be the best teacher in the world, and that's fantastic. Or you could be the best plumber in the world, and that's fantastic. Or engineer, or whatever, you know. I think, though, everything we do, when there is a conscious relationship to the natural world, we are we do better.
Amen.
So for me, that's what I would.
Yeah.
And do it without your phone. You don't have to put it on. Really.
Yeah, first of all, I agree with everything you just said in terms of where I also find my inspiration and what I would share with a young person. In fact, there's an exercise that I've often offered where, find the places where your joy and the world's needs intersect and then just follow that, what Joseph Campbell called follow your bliss. But especially come into a more intimate, personal, yummy, soul nourishing relationship with the natural
Yes,
world.
exactly.
Yeah.
To me, that's what. Once you're there, you're good to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Amy, anything that you'd like to say just in conclusion around this theme of the future is calling us to greatness, and then how can people learn more about your work?
Well, my website is www.environmentaldebt.net, and that's where people can learn about me. Although I am speaking all over the place in the fall, and I think that what would I? Is there anything more I want to say? I guess I want to thank you for putting this together. It's been a total pleasure to speak with you. And I do think that the future is calling, I agree with you, the future is calling us to greatness, because if we do not behave with our greatest selves, we will lose our world. And the world will survive, but it will be tough. It will be really, really tough.
Yeah.
So I think that is, I mean, we have to step up. And
Amen.
I would also say that the idea of radically cooperating with people who you think you have nothing in common with,
Yes.
you have something in common with them. And that is your need for the natural world. Start there. So,
Yeah. That's great. That's great. Well, Amy, thank you so much for your work, but also thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with me and to participate in this sort of larger conversation around how is the past rooting for us and how is the future calling us to greatness. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I look forward to hearing more about it.
Okay, great.
You
Okay.
be well.
Okay,
Take
you
care.
too.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.